So welcome, Dave Ranju. Nice to see you.
Indeed.
Nice to see you.
Yeah, thanks for inviting us.
Oh, well, thanks for coming. We had a chat in the flesh, in the rare days of podcasts that were recorded not on Zoom. I think it must be 2019, just around the time that this book came out, Embodying the Yoga Sutra, and really want to build on that conversation today. But for those who didn't hear it, the sort of nutshell version is I'd come out of a kind of scholarly context and wanted to sort of say, why are you writing about the Yoga Sutra as if it's something you can embody? Doesn't it just say you're supposed to sit down and shut up? So I guess in the spirit of rewinding to where we were, I just wonder why you chose that title when the text is ultimately talking in some ways about going beyond the body.
Disembodying.
Well said, Ranji. Exactly. Yeah.
Well, before you can disembody, you have to embody. You have to come into yourself. I mean, and I feel that our contemporary world is possibly the least embodied culture of humanity that there has ever been, that we are entirely living in our heads. Entirely, but we are living predominantly in our heads. We're living a lot of our lives in some kind of virtual world, if we're in a modern Western context. The educationalist in a famous TED talk, Ken, what was his name? Ken, whatever his name was, Ken, I've forgotten his second name, but anyway, Ken, that Ken, who did a really good education talk on the TED podcast. He said that it sometimes feels like our bodies are basically trolleys to move our head from one meeting to another, and sometimes sometimes it feels like that. So the Yoga Sutra has got masses of really helpful, whatever Patanjali, whatever academia or whatever Patanjali meant. Even so, there is a massive amount of stuff in the Yoga Sutra which is very helpful for an embodied experience. And wherever you go post-embodiment, embodying is the first place. It's a bit like, people talk about transcending the ego, or whatever. But if you transcend the ego from an already unstable place, you're likely to get psychosis, or you're likely to get some kind of disintegration of personality. And it's far better to actually start by stabilizing one's mind. Stabilize before transcending, and I think that applies to the body as well.
Yeah, I mean, I just had a couple of things to that. I think one thing is I would say that the word embody kind of means to put into practice as well as actually into the physical body. And I think that's one part of the idea of the book, is actually to embody it in a sense of to make it real and something that you can practically use. I think it also acknowledges the fact that for most of us, our yoga practice starts with asana these days. It starts with the posture work and the breathing. And to be fair, the majority of the teachings we receive within this tradition are about those kinds of practices. And the Yoga Sutra was used as the basis for explaining those kinds of practices. So from that point of view, whatever its original intention might have been, the way that we were taught it and the way that we applied it was very much to bring those principles into the bodily practice. Just as a final adjunct, this is a little sort of just a little sticking the pin in a little bit. I do think there's a lot of talk about yoga and embodying, and it's important for us all to embody this, to become embodied. I think there's a bit of bullshit about that, actually. I think it's gone a little bit too far. And although I accept what Ranjit said, is that a lot of us are very disembodied in our life, I don't necessarily think in order to take the journey of yoga, you have to spend such a lot of time embodying. I mean, I still think Yoga Sutra is basically about this. That's the bottom line.
Mm-hmm.
That's a great point, Dave. And anyone who's not watching the screen, tapping the side of his head there. And it's in, you know, yoga is there's this chant that the Iyengar world produces at the start of a class, talking about you know, kind of honoring Patanjali, yogena chittasya.
Yep.
So it's for chitta. It's not for the purpose of the body. Then goes on to say that there was you know, another Patanjali who had his medical knowledge, who helped us out of other kinds of difficulties. But yeah, yoga is a practice relating to what's going on between the ears. But I take both of your points. I think really, for most of us, it's very hard to engage with that, you know, abstractly. There are many more people who are going to a postural yoga class and going on a long silent meditation retreat, for example. And there's a different discipline involved, but they're leading to a similar place, perhaps, depending on how you engage with both practices, I suppose. So I wonder, with you know, the body being something that's obviously been brought to the center in the last 100 years of yoga teaching, and as you say, with an association with the Yoga Sutra as the means, how that really gives us much to hold on to in you know, Patanjali's philosophical terms, given that he is talking about the mind, and the only thing he's really talking about doing with the body is stabilizing it.
Sthira Sukhamasana, making it stable and comfortable in order for it to, you know, in order to move into pranayama and then samyama, dharana, dhyana, samadhi. I feel that there are many different levels which you can take the Yoga Sutra. I'm thinking of fractals, you know, fractals where you kind of you go in and it's the same pattern at a more subtle level, and then you go in again and it's the same pattern at a more subtle level. I'm thinking something like that with the Yoga Sutra, in as much as much of, for example, what Patanjali talks about in the highest states of samadhi is this kind of a narrowing down and a kind of a refining and this kind of channeling in high states of samadhi. And each time you narrow down and channel it, there's also there's a sort of an opening as well. It sounds contradictory, doesn't it, to narrow down and channel and then open simultaneously, but each narrowing down is like an intensification of a process which opens something else out, maybe like going through, like increasing the magnification on something and then seeing in finer and finer detail. Maybe you could take something like that. And there's lots and lots of sutras about this, about these esoteric states, particularly at the end of chapter 1, these various different refined states of samadhi. But that process of focusing and relaxing and opening is also the process with which you get to samadhi, which is dharana, dhyana, samadhi. And then that focus itself, you can apply that kind of narrowing down and focusing in order to open, you can apply to pranayama and you can apply to asana. So it's a kind of at grosser levels. It's the same, it's almost the same process, but at different levels. And I think you can get very, very into the esoteric fine stuff of Patanjali and become obsessed with, not become obsessed with it, but, you know, become very focused on that. The same principles can be used at much grosser levels of the body, I think. Is that answer? I can't even remember what your question was.
Well, it was really asking how it relates to, something physical, given that it is, about the refinement of perception. And I suppose what always struck me when reading your book was how you grounded it much more broadly in Sankhya philosophy. And anyone who's not studied a lot of Indian philosophy might wonder what that's all about. But to sum it up very simply, talking about how things materially manifest. And so understanding embodiment as a way to actually understand reality, as a way to perhaps see beyond to these more refined states, does fit into that fractal perspective. It's all about paying attention, and then it's all about also how are things aligned, and what one can do with that perspective, perhaps.
I don't know what Dave. I'm sure Dave's got some things to say, but one thing I'd like to say in terms of that is very much we're body, breath, mind. They're the three portals. But in terms of those three portals, in terms of those three aspects of ourselves, it's just always easier to go in through the grosser level of body. The body is seen as a grosser, more tangible, more substantial thing than the breath or the mind, and they lead to each one leads to the next. So we can think of the engaging with the most tangible and the grossest as the doorway to move into something more subtle. And in that sense, working with embodiment through asana leads to embodiment through pranayama, leads to perhaps moving into more subtle realms of meditation. So there's a kind of an order in terms of subtlety. Start with the grossest first.
Yeah, I mean, I also think that I'm trying to think of the best way to express this, really. Whatever you're doing, whether you're embodying, moving, jumping around, sleep, I was going to say sleeping, yes, even sleeping, actually, your mind's involved. And there's a certain quality of awareness that's involved, whether you're doing asana, whether you're doing pranayama, whether you're sitting trying to, I don't know, just visualize something or focus on something. So the mind is the constant there, actually. And in a way, yes, Patanjali talks very much about these states of meditation, but why can't these states of meditation be around the body, around the breath, in pranayama? In fact, that's something that's mentioned a lot in the Yoga Sutra. It's even there within the the chapter 3, where we have all the siddhis. A number of them are located in the body, it seems. So I think you can be working with the mind in a kind of embodied, moving, physical practice, in the same way you could do it within a breathing practice, in the same way you could do it within just a plain sort of meditative practice. I think the common element is the mind. It's the attitude and it's the state of mind that you bring to it. And I think this is the way that we were kind of taught to practice the asana and pranayama. It's about how do you do the asanas? How do you do the pranayama? What's your mind doing in that process? So I think that's the I think the mind's the common element, basically.
And obviously, unless we have a full frontal lobotomy or shuffle off this mortal coil, then the mind is in some way engaged.
Yeah, exactly.
And that leads me sort of even beyond the realms of asana practice, when you're talking about an embodied sort of moving experience. Being alive is an embodied engagement with the world around, in which the mind is in some way involved.
Indeed.
And I wonder then, what it means to practice yoga in life rather than in terms of these physical techniques.
Yoga off the mats, you're talking about?
Yeah, I just sort of the yoga of being alive. What would it mean to bring this yogic quality into day-to-day life. I mean, several of the chapters of the book actually address that in their titles, and then go on to speak, quite specifically, practically and philosophically about that. But I'm even curious to go beyond that to the realm of everyday conversational English. What is it that makes life lived in a yogic way, as opposed to a more mindless or less disciplined, would be another way of thinking of yoga way?
I think it's really go on, Dave. Go on.
No, you go first.
I think it's really delicate to start talking about yoga beyond the mat without sounding either pious or hypocritical. Okay, so that's the first thing I'd like to say, because
well acknowledged.
Pious or hypocritical. Okay, so Patanjali talks about yamas, our relationships, niyamas, our attitudes, and perhaps that would be a good. And he also, in chapter 1, Sutra 133, he talks about how we might relate to other people, different types of people. There are some very good guidelines. You see, we all have personalities, and we also have tendencies, and we also have we have strong patterns in our behavior. Maybe the first thing that we can acknowledge is that we have some potential to ameliorate some of our negative traits, and actually consciously bringing an awareness into how sometimes we're unconsciously acting unskillfully. That could be in the realms of lifestyle or relationship. I mean, we've all been in situations. Anybody who's done any yoga will know that they will have experienced imposter syndrome for sure, because we've all screwed up in our relationships at one time or another. We've all lost it. We've all kind of thought, oh God, all of that kind of stuff. So first thing, don't give yourself too hard a time. But on the other hand, I think yoga does offer us some tools to just step back a moment and acknowledge that what is it that we're doing which is contributing to our suffering? What in the Sankhya Karika is called adhyatmika dukkha, suffering that we create of our own momentum, of our own making. And yoga does address that and says, there's quite a lot of it. There's quite a lot of it that we're doing. It's not just everybody else. It's what are we doing? And I don't know. That's my starting point. Dave, help me out.
Well, I was just basically, I was going to say, what Deska Joel used to say, or said several times at least, the measure of yoga is your relationships. So he felt very clear about that actually, really the purpose of your yoga practice was to live in a way that was better, whatever that might mean. And I think that's true. Even at the level, if you do a yoga practice regularly and you feel a little bit more peaceful in life, it's something. It's something. But I think if you look at the psychology that's presented in the Yoga Sutra, for example, there are all sorts of ideas about the mechanisms of how the mind works and how the mind will create suffering for us, and how the stories that we run and tell create difficulties. So I do think, and I mean, I get what Ranji says, and I completely agree. Whenever you start talking about this, you just start to think about, well, if I look in the mirror, How
Well,
am
this
I
is
doing?
healthy, I think. There's another sort of the other side of the coin to what Ranji said is, anyone who's not actually bigging themselves up and telling everybody else what to do is probably on the right path, because they're actually conscious of the fact that, they are flawed. We're all flawed. To admit that is probably quite helpful. I find it just as difficult. I mean, I'm sitting here in pain from perhaps yoga-related injuries that have made me feel like I've got no right to tell anybody anything, because I'm sort of rather unskillfully coping with it day to day at the moment. But at the same time, we've learned things, and it's it's important also to, as Ranji says, be I guess open to seeing how that works and to talking about it, because there is something. Come back to your point, Dave, about living with others, and it's real that something can soften perhaps in what might otherwise be sharp-edged interactions.
Yeah, and I think that's a really nice way to put it, actually. I think I think it's nice to think about that the idea of our relationship to the world being a little softer, a little more kind of easy somehow. And we should always remember, I mean, I remember that this came from a Buddhist teacher, actually, that it's very easy when you get involved in anything like this to kind of almost like set a sort of a goal of perfection, when actually, the reality is, as you already pointed out, we're all flawed, and at best we're all on a path of training, and that means you're not there yet. And I think it's always important to remind myself of that. It's always a work in progress.
It's a really nice phrase, that the training. The Buddha, from my little reading of his discourses, because there are rather a lot of them, I've certainly not read them all, it was given to speak of what he taught as a system of training, and really the only kind of place to get is to not be in need of any more training, because you've removed the sources of suffering, and most of us are struggling with sources of suffering in some way. And I wonder if either of you might feel comfortable sharing a way in which yoga had helped you to remove some of the causes of suffering, in terms of the additional anguish that you carry around about it.
Something specific. I mean, I was just thinking that I have no doubt that over the 30 years that I've been 35 years that I've been practicing yoga, I mean, it's a pretty low bar, but I'm definitely a better person for having practiced yoga. Okay, with that's non-specific, but I do feel yoga has been a positive influence on who I am today. Specifically, have you got any specifics, Dave? I
was sitting here feeling a little bit uncomfortable, thinking, what specifics can I think about? It's quite hard.
Well, I'll go first then, just in the spirit of kind of like throwing myself off the cliff and seeing if anyone wants to follow. But I mean, I suppose I was talking about pain, and actually one of the things that I did recently that I found really helpful was to go to a Russian sauna in London, a good old-fashioned steam house, a banya, where you get birched expertly for 10 minutes and then sort of get dunked in an ice bath afterwards. And 3 or 4 rounds of that, I came out in probably a deeper state of calm than I've been in from yoga or meditation practice in quite some time, because it was like a sort of jolt into another dimension. And as a result of that, I realized that my relationship to my pain had changed in the way that it had in previous experiences of long meditation retreats, of seeing the way in which I was stiffening in response to it, and making it was like a sort of metallic feeling in my body that was getting more and more solidified and a conductor of the discomfort. Whereas instead it was as if it was suddenly, I suppose that's where I got the softening metaphor from. It was as if it was encased in some very kind of forgiving liquid that allowed it all to just sort of come to a standstill and no longer be bolting this charge up my spine. And I realized that if only I could do that all day long in relation to everything that came at me, I would never have any problems ever again. There would just be stuff that happened, and I would just be absolutely fine with it just here.
It's a really, really nice way of putting it. I mean, you've described that really well, I think. That hardening around a particular source of anguish or discomfort or whatever, and then that becoming a conductor. I mean, I think there have been many times in my life where I've witnessed that. I'll tell you one thing that's has helped me at various times to, well, a couple of things at various times to somehow relinquish some stickiness, shall we say, around pain, emotional or physical, is breath work. So obviously there is something around the exhalation which leads to a release, and I think I've got quite a high tolerance for pain, and I think part of that high tolerance for pain is my ability to just kind of drop into long exhalations and you know, focusing on that. So that's just a practical thing. I also think that sometimes the use of sound, I mean, within the way Dave and I have been taught, and our interests as well, we've spent a lot of time doing chanting as well, Vedic chanting, and I think there have been many times where I've kind of really cracked through long, complicated passages of chanting, which have really transformed my state of mind. I feel that they've been an emotional release, and a way of kind of expressing something and just clearing out emotional stickiness. I'm not saying it was resolved, but it's certainly is enough to give me space. What's not great is acting. I mean, even the sutras talk about this in the early part of chapter 2. When you're acting from a place of klesha, when you're acting from a place of, you know, ravishing anger or desire or aversion or sort of self-importance or fear, when you're acting from that place, you're likely to compound your suffering. And some of yoga practices have been able to just give enough space to not react quite so impulsively, and that could be through practice of chanting or through the practice of some kind of breath control, breath focused practice. It gives one a little bit of space.
I'm drawn. Sorry, go ahead, Dave. Yeah, please.
No, in the spirit of throwing yourself off the cliff. Here we go. I mean, first thing I say, I think it's quite difficult to be very clear about it, because on the one hand, you don't know how you would have been if you didn't do yoga. And so, you know, it's like to have a kind of objective lens on a question like this is actually really, really quite difficult, I think. I just thought I'd say something about, I mean, I don't really know why I got into yoga. I was kind of, for some reason, I just thought I was interested, and just started to have a go. As I say, I don't really know what it was. I didn't really know what the topic was, you know, what yoga was all about, really. But what I did see, and I think this has been a motivator for me, was that my father suffered from a lot of anxiety and depression in his, and you know, he spent a life suffering and dealing with that and taking a lot of drugs. It was the, you know, 60s and 70s where they were handing out sort of drugs like sweeties, basically. And from quite a young age, I kind of felt that, you know, I didn't want to go there, basically. And I think that's been a strong motivator in my life. Not particularly conscious of that necessarily in my earlier life, but looking back, I think that was a really important thing. And so I think one of the things that I thought yoga was a way of helping me to deal with all of this. And it has. It's given me lots of tools to help deal with it, because I am definitely my father's son, in the sense I've got a nervous system that is quite reactive. Those same kind of possibilities are there in me. I haven't lived the same life as my father did. There were certain issues that were difficult for him, which were not there for me, but I've got that possibility. I can see that. And I think, yoga's given me lots of tools to cope with that. But I think I used to think of it was a bit like an anesthetic to the pain of life. That's kind of, I think, how if I did my yoga practice, it was almost like inoculate me from all of this stuff. Well, I've definitely realized that's not the case, for sure. But I think what it has done is, apart from giving me some tools that I can use to help cope, it's changed my relationship to what goes on in me. And I kind of feel that often I can have a certain, I can see things happening, I can see certain patterns appearing, and I can almost like perhaps stand back from it a little bit, not necessarily having to get rid of it, but knowing that this is something that is taking place and it will pass. And I think that kind of perspective, I would say, is I think the way it's helped me more than anything.
That's really interesting, Dave.
And I think that's definitely a work in progress. I might have to.
Life is a work in progress, isn't it? Really? In the end.
Yeah.
I think there are certain. Whilst you were talking, it kind of reminded me of certain times in practice. When I'm in practice, I'm really. This is kind of like the fruit of asana and the fruit of pranayama, but probably the thing that is most valuable in my yoga practice, whether it's asana, pranayama, or chanting, is that kind of feeling of dropping into something very, very silent and profound afterwards. So it's usually the sitting afterwards, even if that sitting is relatively brief, there's a kind of contact with just a profound okayness. There's a profound okayness. Everything is okay at a profound level. And just touching that and being present with that is and touching that, pretty much every day, even if it's for a few seconds, is really important for the rest of the day, I think. Yeah. And having an ongoing relationship with that, every day, touching it, it's okay, even when it's not okay.
It's a great mantra. It's okay. Yeah. It's so easy to get lost in with all of the various conditioned reasons for it not being okay. And there are many things that obviously aren't okay in the world, but how we relate to the world can still be, it's okay. We can then be fully present to it. And I think taking what Dave was saying, which I felt really touched by, about trying to inoculate oneself against the challenges of the world, is something I've spent a lot of my life doing that in different ways, whether taking various substances to numb my feelings, or hiding away in a yoga cave of one kind or another, and realizing that actually there's nothing other than life. We're here, and actually I'd rather dive in fully, but it doesn't have to be with the kind of wide-eyed, crazy abandon of my early 20s. Of bring it on, let's have a full-fledged adrenaline rush version of everything. Can just be almost as the Bhagavad Gita talks about it, allowing everything to flow through. So right there, the storm in your face, and it's okay, it's fine. Here I am. I feel what I feel. It's strong, and I think that's where what you described, Ranju, this sort of reacquaintance with something that reminds us that it's okay, is what gives us enough of an anchor to not be completely blown off our feet by all that stuff.
And I think you've kind of, you know, the purpose of practice, a very important part of practice, I think, is to give you the anchor.
Mm-hmm.
You know, allows you to just sort of drop the anchor from time to time. I think that's a really important part of it.
I think I'm drawn back to the subtitle of your book, which, if I remember rightly, was going to be originally the title, Support, right. Direction and Space. Ranji was speaking earlier in terms of, you know, the sort of the spaciousness into which we could sort of, you know, kind of accommodate ourselves. And there, Dave, you were talking about the anchor, the support. So yeah, these three elements are already in there, and I wonder if either of you might like to say something about direction, and how that relates to this conversation about life.
That's an interesting question. Well, I think as human beings, we're always following directions. I mean, direction in a sense is a metaphor for intention, interest, yes, a flow of energy, a kind of movement, all of those sorts of things, really. And I suppose that the question is how to engage with the different aspects of life in a way that's most skillful for us. You know, what is the direction for us at any particular time, or what is the direction that it's good for us to take? What is it good for us to be interested in and not be interested in? I think all of those things are aspects of direction. And I think where this practice, or this formulation of the practice in terms of support and direction is useful, is to consider, well, what are our supports that allow us to find our direction? And that's something that we seek to do both within the practice, you know, a particular way of perhaps working with asanas or pranayama or meditation, but it's also, you know, that's also a principle we can think about in life. You know, what are the fixed points in our life? What are the points in our life we can rely on? What are the important values and important values in our life? These are all kind of, they all act as support, really, and they all help us to find a direction.
A really interesting way of putting it. Almost the purpose bubbles up from groundedness in the things that we value. Yeah.
So one of the kind of metaphors that we can play with these three words, support, direction, and space, is that support is something which, if you push against it, or if you lean into it, it retains its stability. So you kind of can rely on it, a bit like a chair. You know, if you lean back in your chair and it collapses, it's not a good support. But if you can relax into your chair, if you can give yourself to the chair, and you know that it will hold you, then that's a good support. And in some senses, the way we relate to our supports, and this isn't just at a physical level, this is also obviously at a psychological level, our relationships, I mean, food, whatever it is, if we can learn how to take support, trust our supports. And I think, Dave, I think you wrote quite a lot in chapter 1 of our book about the walking stick analogy, about how, you know, you have to actually learn how to take support, to relate to your support, and not just that, but then to receive, to see what is coming back from you have to give something of yourself in order to receive something back. And out of your relationship with your support, which does involve an active relationship with your support, out of giving, something comes back and a direction might be revealed. So it's actually about our relationship with our support, kind of, if it's healthy, I mean, I hope this doesn't sound too esoteric, but, you know, if we have a good relationship with our support, then that relationship in itself will reveal a direction.
I don't think that sounds too weird at all, Ranji. I think it sounds very much the extension of what Dave was just saying, and that it's almost, when I've talked about these concepts, I sometimes refer to your book when I'm talking to trainee yoga teachers, and about this sort of quality of trying to find some sort of harmony between two things that are almost pulling in opposite directions, and grounding down while sort of extending in a particular, the kind of plane. And like a tree, it grows tall because it's got roots. So it's a very similar process of investing downwards in order to move upwards, or whichever polarity or spectrum we're talking about.
I always think, given my background was originally engineering, I always think of one of Newton's laws of mechanics: to every action there's an equal and opposite reaction.
It's true.
So where did this sorry, go ahead, Ranji. You were about to say.
Well, I think this formulation, which originally came from Peter, I think we've kind of it's really been that support direction space thing has been hugely important certainly to me. Almost like, sometimes very simple things can just keep on giving and giving and giving, and you can kind of apply this in so many different arenas. And I think our relationship with our support is really something to think about and consider, because sometimes it's very easy to get glued to our support or stuck to our support. And when we get glued and stuck to our support, a direction isn't forthcoming because we're glued to our support. So not only do we have to actively take support on some things, but we also need to be free in relationship to that support. Otherwise, the support itself becomes an imprisonment. That could include yoga itself. The practice of yoga itself can be an imprisonment. And I'm sure we've all known people who are so kind of obsessed with purity or obsessed with cleanliness or obsessed with anything, that their lives become problematic because it's a kind of an addiction. So how we relate to that support is really important in maintaining the ability to clarify a direction, and it's out of the relationship between support and direction that some sort of space opens. I think with abstract principles, it's just a really beautiful master key.
I wholeheartedly agree. And when I've been trying to illustrate it, I can't remember where I got this image from. I wound up trying to talk about it in terms of a triangle. So if we're talking about the gunas and the arising of the spacious sattvic quality, that's the top part of the triangle. Sure. And then you've got these two polarities of rajas and tamas in the bottom corner, and that's the sort of the slider that we've got some control over, whether we're going to one extreme or the other, or trying to find some balance. Except obviously there's also the vertical plane, so we're jumping around somewhere in this triangle. And yoga is basically, in Patanjali's terms, eventually saying, blast yourself off in the spaceship outside the triangle where there's nothing that we can possibly think of beyond thought, beyond the body, and yet to do that, obviously you have to familiarize yourself with what's happening in this triangle. And it's not really possible to cultivate just purity, pure clarity. I mean, if it was, we just push that button and mainline some of that stuff instead.
Well, the Sankhya Karika itself talks about the guna in the terms of a metaphor of a lamp, an oil lamp. So the tamas we could link to support. We could link tamas is about stability and support. Rajas, which is about movement, could link to, in terms of the oil lamp metaphor, we could say that, from the Sankhya Karika, that the tamas, the stability, is the wick. There's something kind of very solid about that. Or even the pot itself. The oil which is moving in the lamp can be the rajas, the movement, the direction. And it's only through the interaction between the wick and the oil that a one-pointed still flame, if the interaction is great, then you've got a one-pointed flame. But if it's not good, the flame's going to be spluttery or burning too, there might be wind or whatever it is. So the quality of the sattva, the quality of the space, is dependent on the relationship between the tamas and the rajas, and I think that's another principle which kind of runs throughout Patanjali and runs throughout. Hopefully, it runs throughout our book. That's what we were trying to illustrate.
Yeah, and I think that we've kind of alluded to it. I don't know whether we've actually said it explicitly, that in some sense, support represents the positive role of tamas.
Yes.
Direction represents the positive role of rajas. And spaciousness, in some sense, is linked to sattva. So I kind of feel in that formulation, which, as we say, we didn't originate that. I think in Peter Herznack's conception of this, I'm sure that idea was at the back of, well, I wasn't going to say at the back of his mind, probably at the front of his mind.
I think the important thing that you emphasize very clearly in the book is that these are just qualities of existence. They're not positive or negative in and of themselves, and all the texts make that clear, although the Bhagavad Gita is full of all of these verses categorizing everything in terms of wonderful, not so great, and absolutely terrible, as if there's a sort of hierarchy involved. But they're just elements of a way of making sense of reality, and then also therefore a way of making sense, as you put it in the book, of relationships. And seeing how to, in terms of interaction with something outside of this mind and body, there's some control to a certain extent over what's arising, and whether the spaciousness opens up to bring something quite joyous and wonderful to a relationship depends on the skillful management of pulling on which lever and knowing the moment to do that. And so it's a really helpful tool for thinking in that way. And
I mean, I think it's a very curious one, because on the one hand, rajas, tamas, and sattva, as you say, are presented as they're just qualities, and in a sense they all have a role to play in all of life, and yet there is this kind of, well, sattva's the best. They're all equal, but
one is more
equal than others.
Well, if you want clarity in life, obviously, that has to arise. But it's like it's the fruit, to come back to Ranji's formulation of doing other things skillfully. And so in the end, that will come, and you'll be able to see even beyond sattva, supposedly. Not that they've ever spent any time in that position, but
the Charaka Samhita, this Ayurvedic text, does talk about the fact that rajas and tamas are the doshas of the mind, which means that they are the ways which the mind goes out of balance. I mean, sattva doesn't really. Sattva isn't an imbalance of the mind, whereas there could be excessive tamas or there could be excessive rajas. I mean, I suppose theoretically, could there be excessive sattva? I don't know.
I don't think there can be an excess. I mean, the Gita says the only problem with sattva is you can just get, it's another thing you can get attached to, and you can think that you're, so enlightened effectively, and
that sounds a bit like
still a quality of the mind. Well, it would be a tamasic level of sattva.
Exactly.
In the end, though, it is still of the mind, and if the objective is to see beyond all of that, then it's still a quality of the mind to get attached to, I suppose, is the idea. But you're right. I don't think you could always have more sattva, I think.
So I think though that in that sense, rajas and tamas, have the potential to not be as good, shall we say?
In the comparison, and this idea from Ayurveda is actually interesting, because if you think of the dosha of the body, Vata, Pitta, Kapha in Ayurveda, they are those things that can go out of balance, but they're also necessary for the function, for the correct function of the body. And I think rajas and tamas are like that, actually. So I think that analogy works very well if you understand the dosha in that sense. We can't live in the world without rajas and tamas, and yet they're the things that are likely to cause us problems.
And actually, I almost want to take back what I just said before in light of that, in the sense that, you know, somebody who was maximally sattvic might not be so much fun to hang out with. Right? A little bit of rajas, you know, you've probably got some energy, and, you know, at the same time, so it's nice to hang out with some more chilled people once in a while too. So I think in reality, there is that as part of being alive, is these things.
Yeah, but I suppose, you know, again, taking the dosha analogy, what are the things that are likely to go out of balance and cause us problems? They're the dosha, and the dosha of the mind are rajas and tamas. That's where we're likely to get into to create suffer, you know, our own suffering, if you like.
Bouncing between depression and anxiety, basically.
Well, exactly.
Yeah, basically.
Very good point. Yeah, that's exactly what it is.
Yeah.
So to kind of bring us back to where we began, we're talking here about relationships, and you talk in the book about really effectively yoga being a project of, you know, upgrading the quality of our relationships, since we are, you know, in materiality, and unless we are, you know, sort of setting the controls for the heart of the sun, so to speak, that's probably where we're going to stay for this incarnation. Why then the focus on a text, the Yoga Sutra, that is actually more aligned to the dismantling of connections rather than the perfection of them?
I think this you know, the Yoga Sutra was the text. I mean, Dave talks about the heart text in Buddhist traditions. If that's right, there's different traditions have a heart text. I mean, this was the text that we were introduced to, schooled in, deconstructed, picked over and over, and I feel that the Yoga Sutra, whatever anybody says about it, the Yoga Sutra has got huge amounts to offer us, and that is the lens through which we have looked at, you know, if we look at the Gita or the Upanishads or the Pradipika, or, you know, whatever other text that we're looking at, it's from the sort of, okay, Yoga Sutra is our support. Whichever direction we go in, you know, the Yoga Sutra is our support. And we've been schooled in it in a particular way, and I think it's served us very well as a support, as this kind of stable bedrock from which to explore various different directions. Whatever Patanjali meant, you know, the way we've been taught, it has been incredibly useful.
Yeah, and you know, it's worth bearing in mind that some of the interpretations of the sutras that we were taught, if you start to look at some of the traditional commentaries, you think, there's a little bit of creativity, making it practical, and you know, that it seems that there were certain parts of the message of the Yoga Sutra that weren't particularly endorsed or accepted by Krishnamacharya or Desikachar, and that's not new. I realize now that even, you know, if you take somebody like Ramanuja, you know, in his writings, he accepted the Yoga Sutra to a point. Thought he was really good to a point. So, and I think in a sense that's kind of, we've used this text, we've been taught this text in a particular way, which
it's very much
very pragmatic and.
But that's, as you said, it's very much part of a sort of an Indian tradition, isn't
it? It is, yeah, it is.
There are these kind of commentators or whatever who will take a particular text and then kind of utilize it for their own agenda. That sounds a bit manipulative, but I mean, you know, that has been the history of Indian classical philosophy in that way.
That is actually the tradition, isn't it? I mean, you're not supposed to make up a new idea. You just creatively reinterpret the old ones endlessly, and it goes in all manner of new directions. And I suppose, you know, coming at it, you know, really honestly, I can't shake the suspicion that Krishnamacharya was particularly keen on the Yoga Sutra because it's, you know, very well established classical text foundation of one of the orthodox darshanas that happens to have the word asana in it, so a very handy framework for him to hang everything else off. And even though it's not talking about any of the asanas that he was, you know, presenting, it gives a context for what he was trying to do, and anchors what he was trying to do in tradition. And you know, I think,
and increasingly I see his teaching in the light of you know, Vaishnavism, actually. And actually, as I say, you know, you go back to Ramanuja, endorse Patanjali's Yoga Sutra, the 8 limbs of yoga, but not certain aspects of it. And I think Krishnamacharya was straight out of that mold, actually, without necessarily saying it. I increasingly think that.
I think you're probably right. I mean, I'm less familiar than you are, perhaps, with especially through Desikachar, the way that his teachings were, you know, handed down. But I've been reading some of the things that Desikachar said and wrote via a magazine, Vini Yoga Europe, about his father's teachings on the Yoga Sutra, and particularly about Ishvara and the idea of devotion. And it's basically saying that the whole project of yoga is to get yourself ready for surrender to the divine.
Which is, you know, the Vaishnava ideal, for sure. So I kind of feel that Krishnamacharya was very skillful and Desikachar, in a way. I think sometimes Desikachar gets overlooked in the way that he was able to present these ideas in a very useful way for the West. But I think you know, they were very skillful in making the Yoga Sutra very neutral in some sense, and very you know, palatable to all, actually. But behind it, and I don't think there was nothing malign or kind of conspiratorial about it, but behind it, I think, was this you know, the framework of their family tradition, which was informing how they would understand this text and its place in the practice of yoga, and also its place in I was going to say the practice of life, if you like.
I mean, I think Dave and I, over the last few years, but over the last 3 years, you know, we've been running a course on the Yoga Sutras, just going through each sutra. But in the last 3 years, we've just been going through not just the sutra, but also taking quite a good look at Vyasa's commentary and kind of deconstructing what the traditional commentators have said. And there are many bits of the commentary which really throw light on why Krishnamacharya or Desikachar use this analogy or that. You know, sometimes you think, oh, that's where that came from. I didn't know that. You know, we just sort of heard, oh, Desikachar says X or Y, and then you see it in the commentary. But there are other points where you think, this is quite a different take. This is quite different from what we were taught. And
I'm particularly thinking of Sutra 3.6, maybe. You know,
well, there's a good example. That's a good example. Yeah, absolutely. That's a good example. Which is, you know, I think it would be foolish to throw the baby out with the bathwater and say, oh, well, you know, it's just all made up. I mean, you know, Krishnamacharya and Desikachar, and then our teachers as well, Paul and Peter, you know, they have riffed, and we've riffed as well. We've riffed. Hopefully we haven't taken too many liberties, and hopefully we've been explicit where we have been creative in our interpretation. I mean, I wouldn't want to say that this is what Patanjali said, but we would say one way of looking at this is this. You know, we could liken 3.6. I mean, as you said, I don't think Patanjali would probably recognize some of the ways 3.6 has been interpreted, but I think it's still valid the way that we can interpret 3.6.
I think it is, but I think, you know, I've become more and more convinced of this over the years, that there is an importance, and this is one of the reasons I like your book, because you've done it, to acknowledging the distinction between the use we want to make of a text and as far as we can discern it over many centuries, the original context in which that text had its primary meaning. Sure. And to try and avoid, as you say, saying Patanjali says, and then sort of popping in there everything we want him to have said, and to actually therefore perhaps get more confident in doing what we've been doing here, riffing on these ideas as our ideas, or as our engagement with a traditional perspective as 21st century Westerners. And those distinctions matter, but in the end, from the point of view of trying to put this stuff into practice, coming back to the title of Embodying it, it's all very splitting hairs at the end of the day. It's what are we doing with this now is really all that matters, especially when we're trying to teach a yoga class. getting lost in the footnotes isn't very helpful. People just want some clear guidelines. And I thought, just to finish, coming back to the opening chapter, thinking about relationships, there's one other question I wanted to ask you, but first I'll sort of read very quickly here. Yoga is frequently translated as union, but this is rather misleading in the context of, Patanjali. Obviously, he doesn't have any interest in the connections of things. He's trying to disentangle something, the true self. But the idea of union suggests two things becoming one, you write, whereas central to the idea of this yoking together, that is really the meaning of yoga, the concentration practice in Patanjali's text, is the fact that two things remain two things. They're united only in the sense of being linked, so almost the mind and its object of focus perhaps there, but also in a broader relationship. And you say this lies at the very heart of yoga and it's fundamental to your approach to the subject, because it's in the interaction and relationship that there is yoga, the interplay of two things that are ultimately distinct, rather than the dissolution of everything into one. And it's so popular in the modern yoga world to talk about yoga meaning union and to talk about philosophies of oneness. I just wonder what you might say in defense of duality and philosophies of two-ness. Obviously, in this book, you've presented one. So I'm just curious as to what you might see as the value of those distinctions or binaries.
Ooh. I think the value of them is that it creates a creative axis or an energetic axis that when you've got two things, you can have an interaction. And I think that's a very I think it's a very potent metaphor for life, in the sense that we have to live it, but in some sense, if we get completely caught up in it, we get lost. So there's something about living a relationship, living a difference, one foot in two camps, embracing a kind of a paradox almost, that I think is a creative space. Now, I'm not saying that is an alternative per se to a philosophy of oneness, but I think it's a very powerful metaphor for embodied life, if you can really dig into it. Because that's kind of, I don't know, that's kind of how, that's enough. That's my go. That's my attempt.
Thank you.
Ranju, you can.
Well, I feel that, okay, in my youth, if you listen to, I remember a music lesson that we had. I remember a music lesson that we had where our teacher asked us to bring in our class to bring in some music. So I remember in that lesson there was some Black Sabbath, some Judas Priest, some Led Zeppelin. I mean, there's various sort of heavy metal bands, and they were, doing their stuff. And I remember my music teacher. This wasn't Mr. Squibb. This was after Mr. Squibb. Oh, right, okay. Dave had Mr. Squibb. We went to the same school, but this was actually Mr. Hooker. And he just said, oh, God, it just awful, awful, awful. But the thing was that he wasn't trained in listening to heavy metal, so it all sounded the same. It just sounded horrible. But if you're trained in listening to heavy metal, then you will be able to distinguish Judas Priest from Black Sabbath, from Led Zeppelin, whatever it is. In the same way that, you know, jazz music might just sound all the same. And as we get more involved in a subject, what we do is to make distinctions. We refine, and you can see differences, and those differences start opening up. So I think the process of learning and the process of deepening one's understanding is actually the process of making distinctions. I think that's what it is. Everything is just an overwhelming muddle.
Yeah.
And then you start to think, oh, well, hold on. That's different from that. That's your first distinction. And then you can think, oh, that's different from that. And you can make finer and finer distinctions. Buddhi in the Sankhya Karaka, in the yoga and the Sankhya model, you know, this high state of mind, its function is to make distinctions. Viveka is the sort of ability to discriminate, to make distinctions. So I think that it's very, I know the feeling of at oneness, being at one, is a good feeling, but it's very close to confusion as well. You know, of not making a distinction. Now, I think it's a bit abstract, but making the correct distinction, for example, making a distinction between you and your support, making a distinction between you and your support enables a movement. If you're just glued to your support as if you were one, you're just glued to your support. There's no freedom there. I think that it's really the whole point of making distinctions is to create a space which gives us a possibility of acting in a new way, of acting.
And I think if you want something really practical, think about life.
Yeah.
Really, really practical. If you really start to think about it, almost every situation in life where you experience feeling trapped, uncomfortable, somewhere there's a lack of distinction. That's my hypothesis. And I think if you could approach life's difficulties by looking for distinctions, and it doesn't mean to say that you can be completely, you know, I can be over here and the problem's over there, but on some level that there's something that's got mixed up and confused. And I think that message from the Yoga Sutra is incredibly practical. And for some reason, in the Yoga Sutra, obviously, it's presented at the ultimate level of Purusha and Prakriti. But for some reason, it seems to work in almost every day, every problematic, everyday situation. There you are. There's something to think about.
And the word is Samyoga, isn't it?
And the word is Samyoga, yeah.
Which is this kind of glued together.
Yeah.
So oneness looks very much like Samyoga.
Yeah, I mean, there was an organization. I don't know, have you come across Landmark?
I have, yes.
Yeah. Well, do you know, the crazy thing is they talk about all the time, oh, we've got a new distinction for you. And by thinking about a distinction between two things in life, it opens things up. I heard this and I thought, well, hold on a minute, this sounds really familiar. Yeah. So I'm not endorsing Landmark, by the way. I might point that out. Yeah, but
they did a pretty good magpie job of hoovering up a lot of ideas from all sorts of helpful places, I think.
Well, exactly. And actually, I think that this is an example where, I just think it can be incredibly practical.
Thank you. Now, I think we come back to relationship. You know, no man is an island. We live interconnected to others, and it's very tempting to think, you know, at the same sort of deep level there is no distinction, and perhaps there isn't, you know, if we really take it to the subtlest level, whether we're looking at philosophies of oneness or two-ness. But yeah, practically speaking, we're having a conversation, we're interacting, there is this interaction, interconnection, interdependence, rather than, you know, the beigeness of it all being exactly the same thing.
Yeah.
And we can't really upgrade anything or learn to be more skillful if it's all the same thing. Otherwise, you know, there's nowhere to get the engineering mindset that you just described engaged, you know, really get under the bonnet and see what's not firing the way it should, and you know, give it a little adjust with the spanner or whatever it might be. Yeah, so it's a toolbox, I think, that provides you know, the utility, I think, of philosophy in terms of relating to life. And I think in a way that's what I wanted to discuss, and really pleased that you've come with me on this sort of rather meandering journey from you know, me pointing the finger at your book title to you sending me away with a really powerful point to reflect on. So I'm really grateful to you both for sharing all of those thoughts and insights, really. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you. It's been great, actually.
We should do it again sometime then.
Very happy to. Really enjoyed that. It's always good to kind of get, good. You should definitely, very happy to be provoked and poked and challenged, because that's a good, you know, that is the way to kind of, I don't want to take what we say for granted, and it's good to kind of think, what do we mean by that, or what does that mean, or does that make sense? So always happy to have Dave there as well to say, what do you think, Dave? That's right.
A handy support from which direction can emerge.
Yes, very much so. Very much so. Yeah.
Cool. Okay. Well,
it's been great. Thank you.
Oh, thank you both. Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks, Tanya.